that, let me introduce our discussants and the authors of the very thoughtful essay that Pace was excited and honored to be able to publish that brings us here today. They are Malka Kopel and Palma Strand. Malka and Palma are the co-founders of Civility, which is an organization that seeks to deliberately and intentionally create relationships that are built on empathy and respect for people who are different. And John Esterly is the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, a longtime member of PACE, and John spent, I think, 2 lifetimes on PACE's board of directors. And the Whitman Institute and John in particular have really been driving forces behind the trust-based philanthropy movement, which really centers relationships as the centrifugal force in its grant making and invites other funders to do the same. So with that, John, Malka, Palma, take it away.
All right. I'm going to take it away. I'm Palma Strand. I'm a co-founder and research director of Civility. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Pace, for we're thrilled to be part of this webinar. And I am going to, I'm the only one, but I am going to share my screen because I have some slides that I'm going to share with you. My computer is cooperating. All right. Let's have to do this separately. Okay. Let's make sure I've got my presenter view. Okay. All right, everybody can see those. So my contribution today is to provide an introduction to complex adaptive systems. And I'm going to start with a flock of birds. Flocks of birds are self-organizing groups, which is to say that there's no head bird kind of telling every bird what to do and where to fly. And each bird flies at a certain distance from its neighbors at the same speed and the same direction. And from those kind of in 3 internalized parameters, they guide the interactions between the birds, and voila, you have a flock. You have a complex adaptive system that can fly around objects and obstacles. And this pattern, this flock, emerges at the system level from the interactions of the individual birds. The interactions between the birds that matter. There are many examples of complex adaptive systems in the natural world. Here's another similar to a bird flock. This is a school of golden ray fish migrating. But complex adaptive systems also describe people. They describe human groups and interactions. And we think of those as complex adaptive social systems. And this diagram, which is really simple for something that's really complex, portrays kind of the essential dynamic of a complex adaptive social system, which is you've got individual people or agents interacting and in kind of regular, habitual, customary, kind of normal ways. And these mostly predictable interactions lead to discernible patterns at the system level. That's the social outcomes, the social institutions that you see at the top. And then these social outcomes kind of feed back to the individual people, and they can be reinforced. There could be feedback loops, virtuous cycles, vicious cycles. And they can also be interrupted or shifted. So complex adaptive systems adapt to changing environments and internal and external stressors. So in terms of like people, economies are examples of complex adaptive social systems. We can think of Adam Smith's invisible hand, where order sort of emerges from buyers and sellers interacting. And cities are examples of complex adaptive social systems. People organize themselves in terms of where they live, where they work, where their kids go to school, and the pattern of the city emerges. And kind of getting to the point of our focus today, communities are examples of complex adaptive social systems. And the quality of the interactions in a community leads to the type of community that it is. So if you have polarized and separate communities that, you have a lot of distrust and kind of a lack of cooperation, in those communities, there are clear winners and there are clear losers, but the community isn't sort of working together as a whole. But in communities with kind of cross-cutting webs of relationships, between people who are different, that bridge across those differences, you have collaboration and resilience. And those communities are able to create solutions and initiatives that benefit everybody. So like this murmuration of starlings, the pattern of a community emerges from the interactions, from the relationships of the individual people within that community. So for our purposes today, there's just a few characteristics of complex adaptive systems, social systems, that are particularly worth highlighting. So how the system operates, it's emergent. It depends on the interactions of the people within it. And the emergent team on the right has distributed leadership. Not a single person is calling the shots, which means that different people can kind of step up depending on the challenge. Ideas come from different parts of the group. Team members kind of listen to and learn from each other. Creativity is high. So you can kind of compare that to a more hierarchical organization in which the focus is on a single person. And complex adaptive social systems, oh, my thing is not progressing here. See if I can move it. There we go. Complex adaptive social systems are also non-linear. This is an actual system map that describes the dynamics of the current COVID pandemic. And rather than kind of a linear kind of A to B to C to D sort of flow chart, you see multiple feedback loops, and you see positive and negative causation with lots of different leverage points. And complex adaptive social systems are decentered. Because the character of the system emerges from the interactions of the individuals within it, people can act in ways that kind of either reinforce existing patterns or in ways that challenge and disrupt existing patterns. And when you have a social system, for example, that excludes and marginalizes people of color and reproduces racialized outcomes, so neutrality in that kind of a system really upholds a status quo that is unjust. And change occurs, kind of the flip side of that maintenance neutrality with respect to the status quo is that change happens when people in their spheres of influence take action, and their actions ripple out. So both upholding the status quo and organizing for change are decentered. And from a kind of point of view of civic engagement and democracy, understanding communities, small and large, as complex adaptive social systems provides really a lot of key insights into civic engagement and democracy. So civic engagement, kind of how people are with each other, represents the interactions within a complex adaptive system. And democracy, the emergent pattern or structure of the system, is really grounded in that civic engagement, in relationships of respect and trust that help people or enable people to collaborate and pull together. And so those bridging relationships of respect and trust among people who are different are also the grounding for justice and well-being. So that's kind of a whirlwind of complex adaptive systems. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and send it back to Malka.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Palma, and hi, everybody. I'm Malka Koppel, CEO and co-founder of Civity, and I'm here to give you an example of an organization that uses the complex adaptive systems model, and that is Civity. So as Kristen said, we are an organization that focuses on building a culture of welcoming and compassion and empathy in communities. We work nationally, but we work in communities, particularly to address system inequities. And so we take the complex adaptive social systems model and we focus on the core of the model, relationships. Because we are concerned about systems of inequity, we focus on relationships across difference, particularly those power differences of race and class, for example. And what we strive to do is to change people's view of the other to a view of we all belong and we're all in our community together. We find that change happens when people are put into relationships and with the right environment. We provide a place for people to talk with one another, usually in one-on-one conversations where they can share their own stories, they can see each other, they can hear each other, they can understand each other's complexity, and they can see their shared humanity. The complex adaptive systems model it enables us to use the fact that individuals are part of a system, and that individuals and the relationships between them can transform a system. So for us, individuals transform communities. So looking through the complex adaptive systems lens, rather than spending energy on creating new community infrastructure, we understand that that infrastructure already exists. And we are working more to change that infrastructure than to recreate it. To do that, we focus on leaders, community leaders, both established and emerging leaders. They have access to that infrastructure. Many of them have built that infrastructure and are still building it. And the leaders that we work with are engaged on the ground in making change and working on issues that benefit their communities. They're already tapped into the structure and the work is already underway. So our work is supporting them to focus on the relational aspects of their community, to themselves see the importance of bridging across difference, and to learn how to do it and create the space for others to do it, others in their sphere of influence. So we focus our change on the core of the system, relationships. We concentrate our efforts on the leaders who already have access to the infrastructure and can create the space for divide bridging on the ground. And then we let the system do the rest. So what does that look like? Some examples, we worked with leaders in Redwood City, California, to create a human library where people get checked out by community residents or readers for 20-minute conversations. So someone in Silicon Valley can have a conversation with someone who has been homeless, or perhaps who has been in prison, down and out, in need. And they can, through this conversation, through this relationship that is created in a very short period of time, they can see each other as not just as statistics, but as people. We worked with the leaders to set up a pilot human library, and now it's part of their regular program. We worked with an organization in rural Nebraska, the Center for Rural Affairs, which works to bring inclusion and create more welcoming communities for immigrants, particularly those who are working in the agriculture industry. Through our training, train the trainers, we've done workshops in empathy building and worked with the staff of the center so that this empathy training it becomes part of their work. And now they are doing it on the ground, creating civility. And we're working with leaders in Louisville, Kentucky, across the sectors, business leaders, civic leaders, nonprofit organizations, and members of the faith community to create spaces in their community for people to connect across differences, primarily of race, to confront their racist history, and to bring Louisville as a community to a place where it can be more compassionate and welcoming. So throughout our work, we focus on supporting and creating a fundamental relationality in which people see each other, hear each other, and acknowledge each other's belongingness. That is the complex adaptive social system that we want to see. I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Malka, and thanks, Kristen and Amy again, and Pace for hosting the webinar today and the article. You know, I'm the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute in San Francisco with a portfolio that works to advance equity, broadly defined, but within that really raises up the importance of dialogue and relationships. So we're a very process-oriented funder. And I say that just as an introduction to a short vignette from many years ago. I remember when I was speaking with someone we were just starting to support and thinking of supporting. And we were talking about relationships, and they were talking about how relationship building was a foundational piece of their work. And at one point, she just looked at me and she said, "Oh, you get this. I can say what I mean and talk about relationships without putting it in some grander language or something that describes it differently." And I say that because the thrust of this article, and when we wrote one years before, was to make the case that we need to explicitly value and resource relationships. I think we kind of tacitly or implicitly within philanthropy, I'm speaking generally here, acknowledge it. But then when it comes to looking at measures of impact in terms of funding, it tends to recede into the background. Can't tell you over the years how many times people said, well, we came back to the funder after a year and we said, we've built some really great relationships in the community. And the funder's kind of tapping their foot and going, oh, but we thought you were going to shift the dial on poverty. And you've only built relationships, and so I think I say that in terms of linking it to the complex adaptive systems framework. Is part of that is urging us as funders to be more patient and to support relationships as they emerge over time. And that's something I have done this personally with Civity in our work over the years. And in our article, we mention the evolution of our own relationship as both funder and grantee partner. And we raise that up because I think when we talk about looking at relationships in a systems framework, that means not only the relationships we're supporting out in the community, it also means the relationships we have with the people we're supporting. It also means the relationships we have with each other as colleagues and funders, which plug for PACE, which is why I've always valued PACE so highly. And it also, I think, going forward speaks to the increasing opportunities for funders to work in a more collaborative fashion. And so when we make the case for funders explicitly valuing relationships, we're also talking about urging funders to look at their own practices and how those practices enable both supporting work in the community in different ways, but also get them to look at their own practices that facilitate relationships. From my experience, what we have called and emerged as the trust-based philanthropy approach opens the door to more authentic and deeper relationships. I'm not going to go through the whole trust-based philanthropy approach, but the highlights are, things that many of us have talked about over the years: multi-year unrestricted funding, streamlined paperwork, the foundation doing the onus on them to do a lot of the homework, open and transparent communications, an invitation to be supportive beyond the check. And all these things, when you practice them together, shift the power dynamics that often get in the way, actually, of more authentic relationships. And so in the article, we make the recommendation to explore those kind of practices that enable more authentic relationships. Trust-based philanthropy is an approach we talked about. Others are making the case with different frames or approaches. But another recommendation we make in the article is for funders to more directly support relationship building in their work in community. And I think one concrete example of how that has showed up in the past year is with a lot of organizers. Especially there's a organization called Women Engaged in Georgia, led by Malika Redmond. And she made the point that they were effective in their voter outreach and civic engagements because they are building relationships all the time on a year-long basis. So when I say invest in relationships, sometimes it's investing in organizations that are building relationships all year round. And that creates the basis then for engagement. And her point was that relational, that those relationships they had in the community are different than dropping in with temporary engagements or campaigns. And so I think that's partly what we're talking about here, is to see supporting relationships as an ongoing process of emergence. And that relates to that CIA system. And then finally, a recommendation that we approach our work really from a learning lens strongly, and not necessarily an accountability lens. And that these are complex systems, and so we enter them from a place of humility. We rethink attribution, or let go of that a little bit. What did my money, I want to know what my money caused, and look at more of a systems frame and a relations frame of how it is. And so it's urging us to then look at assessment in some different ways. And I think maybe something we could talk about is when we talk about relationships and trust in a community, well, how do we assess that? What do we mean by relationships when trust is present? How is that manifested? So I think there's a lot of room to start actually intentionally exploring how we look at relationships. So those are three. And then just a final thing is that I think there's a lot of opportunity for funders as connectors and conveners when they take a systems approach. One of the advantages that we can bring often is a more balcony view. And so if we bring a spirit of partnership and leading with listening and not overly controlling what happens in those spaces, then I think there's a real value and opportunity funders can bring into creating trust in communities and strengthening our democracy.